Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for June's Urban Ag Hour. This is a partnership between Cooperative Extension, Urban Ag Production, Small Scale and Beginning Farmer Program, as well as USDA, NRCS, and FSA. We're so excited to have everyone here today, and we have some really great speakers this month. So I'll give just a couple minutes to see if some more folks trickle in before we jump into talks, but I do want to introduce our area agent for livestock, Ashley Wright, here with U of A Cooperative Extension, and she'll be talking about integrating livestock into small acreage operations today. We also have Scott Shulin, who's the risk management specialist with USDA RMA, and he'll be talking about different programs for small and urban farms with RMA today. So please feel free to use the chat, drop your questions in there, and we will at the end have time to do an open Q&A. And without further ado, Ashley, I will let you take it away.
Awesome, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Awesome, okay, let me go. I think you have to stop sharing your screen first. Perfect, there we go. And you should have my PowerPoint slide.
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint slide.
And it doesn't have Zoom on top of it, right?
Nope. It's
good. All good job, Zoom. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Wright. I'm a livestock area agent. I'm housed in Cochise County. I cover Cochise, Pima, and Santa Cruz counties. So mostly I get to work with cow-calf producers, but I do occasionally get to do other things. Such as something like this with the integrating livestock into small acreage operations. So my goal today is to give you guys kind of a high level overview of the things to think about if you would like to integrate livestock into a small acreage operation. Some pros, some cons, a little bit about what some of the different species might be best suited for, and really the questions that you should be asking and answering before you decide to jump into livestock production. With that, let's get started. And Zoom. There we go. Let's talk about some of these benefits of integrating livestock, because there's quite a few, right? Besides just enjoyment, some of us just enjoy being around animals. Number one is soil improvement. We see a lot of soil improvements from having livestock on our land or integrating things like manure into our soils. It increases the organic matter, which allows for increased water holding capacity. As you can imagine, that's a good thing when we're trying to grow crops on those fields later. It also increases the nitrogen and the micronutrient contents, basically increasing that soil fertility. And as we know, on our farms, everything starts with the soil. If we can't get our soil in good condition, we're going to have a hard time growing crops. So livestock could potentially help with that. Controlling weeds. This reduces the need for herbicides. Certain species are really good, particularly goats, are very good at eating and controlling weeds, both in and around fields. And in fields that have been left to go fallow for a year, they can really come in and help clean that area up. They're super great at that, and that reduces our need for inputs, right? No, that means we don't need to come in with pesticides and spray. That also helps us with pest control. A lot of times, those weeds on the edge of the field or in the alleys or runs alongside of our fields may be havens for some pests to live. So by keeping those knocked down, we can help reduce our potential pest issues that we may have going on. And in particular, like our orchards, for example, dropped fruit from orchard trees can be a thing that brings pests into that orchard. And many of our species will actually help keep those cleaned up and keep those fruits picked up and eaten, again, deterring pests. We can reduce our on-farm waste. Many of these species can graze stubble, they can graze leftover crop. They can graze spoiled or damaged crops, as you see these piggies right here enjoying a nice pumpkin. They will eat a variety of things, you'd be surprised. Cattle have been fed everything from leftover Snickers bars. I've been on a hog operation in Indiana that was getting peanut butter, leftover peanut butter containers, spoiled ones from the factory where something had happened and they weren't able to retail sell them. They actually had a cool piece of equipment that got all the peanut butter out of the tubs with minimal effort, and it was part of the pig's diet. They can actually reutilize a large number of things, including some of our waste products. It allows a little extra productive use of what we would call those buffer zones, right? So some of those areas alongside of our roadways, alongside of our fields, and alongside some of those other places that really, we can't really use them for growing a crop there, but we could certainly be able to put some goats or sheep out there to graze that down and give us a little bit extra productive use out of our acreage and allow us to kind of maximize that efficiency. Finally, they could be a great source of additional income and a diversification of revenue. If something happens and you lose your entire crop, you still have your sheep, you still have your chickens, you still have animals for another source of income, another way to raise some funds for that year. And that crop may not be completely lost. It may be spoiled for human consumption, but you may still be able to feed it to your livestock and still get some utilization out of it, so it's not totally lost. So that's just some of the potential benefits. Now, obviously, there's another side to this coin. There's always some potential pitfalls, right? So we talked about them being beneficial to the soil, but there's also some potential for some issues with soil compaction and soil erosion. This is going to be a problem if we are overgrazing. So if we have too many animals on the area that we're trying to keep them in, and we allow them to stay in one area too long, particularly hogs are really hard on pastures, we can start to see some of these issues, but I believe that they can be mitigated with some careful grazing rotation and being really mindful about how we're moving animals through that operation. There's obviously some food safety concerns with animal manure on a farm when we're talking about having edible vegetable species and things like that. Depending on the species of vegetable you have, it's the USDA National Organic NOP National Organic Practices say 90 to 120 days before harvest is when animals should be pulled off of any of that type of stuff, so that there's no more manure. That 90 to 100 days depends on if the portion of the plant that's edible is in contact with the soil or not. So think fruit trees versus potatoes in the ground is going to be the difference there. According to FSMA, it's about 9 months. They need to be pulled off 9 months prior to harvest. And NCAT has a really great publication with an illustrated guide to growing safe produce I'm going to refer you to get some more in-depth detail on that stuff. And of course, we should always be following regulations and best management practices around food safety. So we do need to make sure when we bring livestock in and integrate them into our crop rotation or into our farm in any way that we are paying attention to those best management practices. With livestock, there is always a potential for damage to our crops. This could come in a couple ways. They could inadvertently get out. Bad fencing, goats particularly are escape artists, and they may get into an area that you did not want them and potentially damage some crop that you have going. They could get into greenhouses, they could get into fields, and they could cause some major damage if it's not caught right away. Again, we have some mitigation options here, in particular making sure that when we build fences and confine animals or confine animals out of an area, that we do so with the right type of fencing and that we build it in the right way so that animals aren't getting where they aren't supposed to be. And obviously, finally, these animals are going to come with some additional cost. Nothing is free, animals either. It's very unlikely that a small scale operation is going to be able to produce all the food or forage necessary for an animal species. So you should expect to have some food input costs, some nutritional costs associated with those animals. And when I talk about each of the species, I'll talk a little bit about that. There will likely be some veterinary costs involved. Most of these animals are going to require some specific vaccinations every year, things like that, accidents that may happen where they require veterinary attention. So you should plan on costs around that. There's going to be housing costs. You're going to need to have facilities, depending on the species, to either house them, protect them from predators, or in the case of something like cattle, to handle them appropriately, as well as those fencing costs that I already discussed and those handling facilities. The final potential pitfall is marketing or processing availability, and I have a slide on this towards the end, but that can be a little bit limiting here in Arizona, so it's important to make sure that you've explored your options and understand what is available to you to have those animals harvested in a way that you can take advantage of the products that they produce. So with that, let's move on. And let's talk about some of these species specifically. Let's talk first about poultry. Poultry, probably one of the easiest species to integrate into a small acreage operation. They obviously require very little room. They can be very profitable, and you have opportunities for both egg and meat production in this case. Meat birds have a very short turnaround. It's only a couple of months until they're old enough for harvest, and a pretty low entry cost. These can either be housed in traditional housing. These could be pastured. either just pastured permanently or the use of chicken tractors, which I have a slide with a photo of a chicken tractor so you can understand what I mean, which is basically a movable pen that allows them to utilize pastures in a very specific way that you can move them and still protect them from predators. That is a concern with this species, is they are very prone to predation. As I like to say, everything likes chicken, and they aren't really very good at defending themselves. So they do consume some forage on pasture, but they will require supplemental feeding. Remember, these are not ruminant animals like cattle. They have a crop and then eventually a regular stomach and digestive system. They will require some supplemental feeding, depending on what they are, with some type of a mixed prepared feed, a mixed feed, some grains and those sorts of things. They are very good at consuming many waste products, such as spoiled vegetables. And the nice thing about poultry is there are some exemptions that allow for on-farm processing of poultry on a much larger scale than is allowed for other species. And this is primarily because there are not a lot of harvest facilities available for poultry, particularly for small producers. Those regulations do vary state by state. They aren't allowed to be laxer than federal regulations, and they can be a little difficult to interpret. So I do encourage that if you're going to go that route, to contact in this case, it'd be the Arizona Department of Ag, so that you can get clear guidance on what those rules are for on-farm processing of poultry. And I have a nice, right there, the University of Maine did a pasture poultry project in 2017 and published the results that actually looked at how much poultry ate, and they used some heritage breeds, looked at how much forage they actually ate versus how much supplemental feeding they had to do, and how well they grew on those rations. So I encourage you, if you're interested in poultry, to dig that up. There's a link here, or we might be able to get that dropped in the chat when I'm done here. I'll pull it and drop it in the chat. But it's also pretty easy to find with a Google search. And here's that chicken tractor. It is literally just a movable chicken coop on wheels. They don't have to look like this. People build them out of a variety of things, but it just allows you to sort of pick those poultry up and force them to rotate through your pasture in a regular fashion. This helps with disease control and prevents them from kind of over digging and grazing in a specific area. It also protects them from predators during this process. Hogs. With hogs, the rotation of pastures is going to be very important due to that soil compaction issue. Hogs can be very hard on pasture if they are not rotated through. You've probably heard the saying, build your fences hog tight. They are very destructive and they will break out of things. So you will have a little higher fencing cost to keep these guys contained properly. They can also eat some forages, but they will need supplemental feed. Again, these are also not ruminant animals. They are a monogastric single stomach animal. So they will require some additional supplemental feed, but they are excellent at disposing of many of the waste products that come out of a farm situation. They are a little susceptible to heat stroke, so making sure we have adequate shade, potentially some misters or some way for them to get into some water during the hot part of the summer here. The good thing about them is, though, they also do have a shorter raising life cycle, if you will. So you could potentially raise some feeder hogs up to weight and sell them before the heat of summer in Arizona. You could cycle them through and just not have them during the summer. It may be a little difficult to find processing, so definitely make sure that you have a place to take them before you venture into this journey. And again, I'll kind of touch on why that is a little bit later in the presentation. Sheep goat, which I've kind of combined into small ruminant here. These are a really great option for a small farm because they are small, they are easy to handle. They have a relatively low startup cost and they don't require a ton of specific facilities to handle them like cattle do. They're excellent users of forage. They are ruminant animals, so that is going to be their primary diet is forages, which would be grasses, cover crop, any of that kind of thing. They're going to be very good at utilizing that with minimal other inputs. Goats especially control weeds very well. The difference here is that sheep tend to be grazers, meaning they will want to eat grass that is around on the ground, whereas goats tend to be browsers and they will go for those weeds, shrubs, and that kind of thing. They are a little bit susceptible to parasites, but that is easily managed with a veterinary plan in place. Goats particularly can be escape artists, so be aware of that when you're building your fences. There is some potential for predation in some areas. They're obviously bigger than chickens and a little able to get away, but if you have large packs of coyotes and things like that, you may find some problems. And again, do you have a market for the products? But here you have a variety of products beyond just meat. These animals could also be dairy animals producing milk that could be made into soap. Obviously sheep produce wool, so you have some options there as well. Again, just a very nice option for a lot of places to integrate onto their farm. Cattle are going to be best when you have large areas for grazing available. Obviously, they're a much bigger animal. They're going to require a lot more input feed. Generally, fencing costs are lower. Cattle are pretty respectful of things like barbed wire, but there's going to be more initial investment in the handling facilities to handle these animals properly. You're probably going to want a squeeze chute. Most of them are not going to be halter broke unless you're buying old show animals. You don't really have predation issues here, very few issues unless you're in somewhere that has a lot of mountain lions or something like that. They do require more feed because they're a larger animal, right? So they're going to have those bigger inputs, but they are a ruminant animal, which means they're primarily going to be consuming forages. Typically, there's a very good demand for products and you'll have less issues finding processing with cattle. These aren't going to be a great choice if you're in a smaller farm or a smaller area, but you may be on enough acreage or have enough grazing space that these might work for you. So how are we going to figure out what we're going to do? Some questions to consider. The first question, how much space and forage do I have available? As I just mentioned, cattle need a lot more space than something like sheep or goats or poultry, or maybe even hogs do. So that's going to be a big driver of what you're going to choose. I have a slide on forage availability. I'll show you how to figure that out in just a second. What marketing and processing opportunities exist for that livestock in my area? Again, do you have access to a facility to harvest and be able to sell your product? Are there people who want to buy your product? Are you going to go to farmers markets? Are there potentially restaurants who want to buy a local product from you? That's going to be some things you're going to need to explore to make sure that you have an avenue for the products you're producing. Especially those of us in more urban areas, as this is the Urban Ag Hour, will my zoning allow me to have livestock? So you're going to need to go to your specific zoning for whatever, if you're in a city or a town, that will take precedence. If you're not, it's your unincorporated county. If you happen to have an HOA, they may supersede those rules. So you'll need to check and make sure your zoning allows for whatever livestock species you want to have. Finally, how will they fit into my current operation and its goals? Am I going to be able to, do I have enough space that I'm not utilizing for something else? Do I have waste products? And what do I fully intend to do with my operation? And does this fit? When we talk about forage availability, you'll typically see that listed as stocking rate, which is usually an animal unit month. And an animal unit month, typically like a cow is 1 animal unit month. A sheep, it's 5. I think it's 5. Sheep or goat is 1 animal unit month. And that's just trying to sort of standardize how much forage a specific species will need to consume over the course of 1 month to maintain their body weight and to thrive on that land. So you can actually estimate that by clipping, drying, and weighing some representative samples from your fields, and then doing some quick math to determine if you actually have the stocking rate to support whatever it is you want to support. In most cases on small farms, it is likely you are not going to have enough forage to support animals year round, but you may be able to purchase hay, you may be able to use some of your waste, your vegetable waste, and the outcomes that you're getting from those animals, the benefit and the extra income may offset those input costs. That's something that's good, you're going to have to factor in on your budget. Obviously, this picture, I did take it, but it was not here in Arizona. This, I believe, was in Indiana. And again, as I mentioned, cattle and sheep tend to graze grass. Goats browse and are really great for weed control. And hogs and poultry do utilize forage, but will absolutely require some additional inputs. We'll also need to consider our manure management. If our animals are already grazing in our pastures, our fields, our buffer zones, or whatever it is, they're distributing their own manure, and we really probably don't have much we need to do about that other than following those best management practices and food safety regulations. If our animals are housed in confinement, such as a small lot, a dry lot, or something of that nature, we may be able to gather and either compost or just spread that manure onto our fields as an amendment, as an additive. And again, always following those food safety regulations and best management practices, depending on the crop that we're raising. Okay, finally, processing livestock. So all of our meat for retail sale is subject to inspection. And there's really 3 types of inspection that happen at slaughter facilities. So the first one is what's called a custom exempt slaughter facility. There are quite a few of these around the state. The animals are owned by the person consigning it to harvest, but that meat is not labeled for retail sale and it cannot be sold. In fact, it's actually labeled not for retail sale. So you could not take an animal to a custom exempt facility and then start selling steaks at the local farmers market. That would not be legal because that animal was not inspected at harvest. The facilities are inspected, but there's not an inspector on site during their harvest process. However, if you wanted to sell somebody a half of a cow, you could sell them a half of a live cow and they would pay the processor the processing fees. They now own the animal and they could take the meat, if that makes sense, but you couldn't sell like retail steaks. A state inspected facility, and there's a number of these around the state, 8 to 10 to 12, don't quote me on that number though, if you have opened and closed in the last couple of years. Meat at these can be sold retail within the state of Arizona. So for both state and USDA inspected, there is a USDA certified inspector on site during the harvest process, inspecting those animals both pre-harvest and post-harvest to make sure that they're safe for human consumption. So that state inspected meat can only be sold within the state of Arizona. There's a little bit of work being done to try to get some reciprocity across some states allowing sales in other states, but I'm not quite sure where that's at right now. USDA inspected, in which there's only, I believe only 4, currently only 3 because the University of Arizona's meat lab is currently closed for renovations. There's only those normally 4 facilities in the entire state that are USDA inspected. And one of them is JBS, which is in Phoenix, and they only take cattle and they only take non-dairy type cattle 1 day a week. And I believe the other one is in Prescott or Chino Valley, but not 100% on that. So these facilities, as you can imagine, can get very backed up at certain times of the year. It is quite likely you will need to have appointments on the books for your animals several months out, if not months and months, 6 months or more out from when you expect that animal to be ready to harvest. So it's advisable that before you dive into this, if you are going to need the services of these facilities, that you reach out to them and find out what you need to do to establish as a client and to make sure that you have, they have room for you when you need them to harvest your animals. And my final few tips for you here. Start small. You don't have to go suddenly bring in 40 head of cattle onto your small acreage farm and expect things to go well. Start with just a few of what you think you might want to work with. Maybe start with some low input, like the poultry or the small ruminants, and kind of see how it goes, see how it integrates into your operation, see what you need to learn, and see what works and what doesn't work. And then you can grow later on. I encourage you to attend trainings and work with a mentor, especially if you have never raised livestock before. There's a lot of very specific things that are going to be important for you to learn, as with anything that we do in life. And it's important to get some knowledge on that. Fences or facilities. Again, if you cheap out on them and the animals get out, the goats get out, they could potentially cause some damage to your other parts of your operation. Consider those added costs of the labor to work with those animals, to do the husbandry tasks that are necessary to keep them in good health, the equipment you're going to need, and just incorporate that into your animal enterprise budget and make sure that you've accounted for those costs. You could also diversify your animal operation as well. You don't necessarily have to just sell a meat product. You could sell breeding stock. You could have pygmy goats and sell breeding stock to 4-H kids. You could process wool into yarn and sell it on Etsy. You could make your dairy goat milk into soap. There's a variety of things that you can do that don't necessarily involve harvesting meat animals if that's not what you want to do. But all those are options. And again, NCAT has a really nice publication on small scale livestock production that kind of goes into a little more detail on each of the species as well as some of the options there. And I'll drop that link in the chat when I'm done here also. And with that, I think that is the end of my slideshow.
Thank you so much, Ashley. A lot of really great information in there. We do have some questions. I'm going to invite Scott to speak about programs that are made for small scale farms, and then we'll do an open Q&A at the end. So please keep the questions coming. We'll have them all lined up and we'll jump into a Q&A after our next talk. Thank you so much again, Ashley. And Scott, I'm going to let you share your screen and spotlight you for everyone on.
Great, thank you. Okay, are you seeing the presentation?
Yes, we are seeing it. It is in the slideshow mode, or we can see sort of all the slides right now. There we go. Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Shulin. I'm a risk management specialist with the Davis Regional Office. And today I'm going to go over just briefly what my agency does. And I'll go over the micro farm and the whole farm programs that we offer. So for those of you who may not be aware, the Risk Management Agency is the agency that regulates and supervises the federal crop insurance program. This is actually a program that we have more farmers and ranchers participating in than any other USDA program. The office that I work out of serves California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and Hawaii. On this map, you'll see the regional office layout throughout the country. These are the states covered by various different offices. So what the crop insurance program is, it's a private partnership between RMA and private insurance companies. So what my agency does is we develop and maintain the programs. We look for compliance issues. We will educate producers on our programs and the risk management tools that are available. And we reinsure the private insurance company. So it is a joint venture. And then the program is subsidized as well. So with the private insurance companies, they'll actually have the crop insurance agents working for them that will actually sell the policies to you. They work with the private insurance companies to service the contracts. They will also adjust claims and pay indemnities. And all of this gets reported to RMA. So we have programs available for over 60 crops, at least in my region here in California. So we offer multi-peril crop insurance, which can be production-based. We also offer revenue-based products, which is what whole farm and micro farm are. So as you can see from this list here, these are programs that we have individual programs for. But any crops that you don't see listed here are things that could be covered under whole farm or micro farm. So those programs are sort of a catch-all for anything we don't have a dedicated program for. So just a little bit of background on these programs. Whole farm was first offered in 2015 as part of the 2014 Farm Bill. Micro farm was first offered in 2022. And micro farm is designed to be a little bit more streamlined and a little bit tailored more towards your small producers. Both the policies are designed to cover the gap for crops that don't have an MPCI policy, as I mentioned on the previous slide. So any crop that's not listed that we don't have a program for potentially could be covered under these programs. These programs are revenue based. So it's going to cover the revenue generated on your entire farm operation. So you can't pick and choose which crops you'd like to insure. It will insure everything on your farm. These programs rely on your Schedule F or your substitute Schedule F tax records. And that's going to determine what your insurable revenue is and for loss purposes. Whole farm and micro farm are available nationwide in all states and counties. So for whole farm, this covers up to $17 million of revenue. But with whole farm, things like post-production costs are not going to be included in that. Your expected values are primarily going to be based on third-party sources. Your expected yields are based on your underlying policy or your 4-year average. So under whole farm, you are able to actually purchase an individual crop policy as well, or in addition to a whole farm. Excuse me. So you may purchase, let's say, almonds or something like that. Excuse me. You could purchase an almond policy, MPCI policy, and you could also take whole farm if you wanted to. That's something you can't do under micro farm. If you do purchase an individual crop policy in addition to whole farm, it must be at a buy-up coverage level, and I'll talk about coverage levels later on here. And any indemnities that you receive from those individual policies will count towards your revenue earned under whole farm. So you won't be receiving multiple payments if you had a loss. So with micro farm, as I mentioned, it's a little less paperwork, a little more streamlined. And the big difference here is it's going to ensure farm operations with an improved revenue up to 350,000 for the first year. And then any subsequent year where you have insurance in effect, that number could go up to 400,000. Another key difference with whole farm and micro farm allows post-production and value-added costs to be included in your approved revenue. And your expected values and yields that are going to be used to determine your total revenue in acres, that could be, for micro farm, that will be your most recent 3-year average. Another key difference here between whole farm and micro farm is that you can't get an individual MPCI policy under micro farm like you could under whole farm. As far as coverage, whole farm and micro farm, as I mentioned, they're going to cover all the commodities that are produced on the farm. That can include industrial hemp, animal products or animals, commodities purchased for resale up to 50% of your total. It does exclude timber, forest products, animals for sport, show, or for pets. Replant costs are available under whole farm with approval, but they're not available under micro farm. So that's another small difference between these two programs. So both programs offer flexible coverage levels for your operation, for your needs, ranging from 50% to 85% in 5% increments. For whole farm, another difference here between these two programs is under whole farm, you have to have a diversification of at least 3 commodities, which what we call a commodity count, if you want to reach the 80 and 85% coverage level. So you could have 50 to 75% if you're growing 2 crops on your farm. But if you would like to get those higher coverage levels, you have to grow at least 3 commodities. Under micro farm, though, the difference is you will automatically qualify for the 80 and 85% coverage levels, regardless of your commodity count. So that's something to consider based on your operational needs. There's no catastrophic level coverage available for either. As I mentioned, what we consider buy-up is your 50% to 85% is the required level for these programs. So as I mentioned, this program is available in all counties and states. You're not required to report expenses for this, which is another difference. With whole farm, there is expense reporting. On micro farm, that's not required. And the individual commodities are not required to have separate expected values or expected yields. And so this is going to be a little bit more geared towards your urban farmers, your small scale producers. Micro farm is offered through whole farm, and it's available, as I mentioned, with those limits, 350,000 or 400,000 if you're a carryover insured. If the revenue exceeds the limits stated above, it'll be capped at those limits, and all revenue will be considered revenue to count. So when they were developing the micro farm program, the reason that they landed on the 350,000 limit is because that limit captures about 85% of the local food producers based on their research. So it's quite a bit of difference between the $17 million limit that you would see under whole farm. So for eligibility for micro farm, as I mentioned, this is going to be based off your tax records, your Schedule F or your substitute Schedule F. So it's going to require at least 3 years of tax records. So for 2023, you would be providing 2020, 21, and 22. We also have different dates depending on if you are a calendar year filer or a fiscal year filer. So producers are going to be ineligible for micro farm if they are vertically integrated, if they have a commodity that is insured by another policy that's issued. As I mentioned, under micro farm, you can't have an individual policy in addition to micro farm. It's not available for expanded operation consideration. So that's something that will be considered under whole farm. If your operation's expanding year over year, we have an expanded operation calculation that can factor in to increase your revenue. That's not available under micro farm. And as I mentioned earlier, replant payments are not available under microfarm. Some special circumstances, again, between these programs, that these are specifically for whole farm, but not applicable to microfarm. There's additional organic commodity requirements. Post-production operations and added value is something that you're not going to find under whole farm, or it's not going to be included. There are additional animal and animal product requirements, nursery requirements. We do also have some marketing contract requirements in there for your expected values. Expanded operations, as I mentioned, we have a way to figure that. And we have direct market commodity requirements as well. So these are all specific just to whole farm and not microfarm. For the coverage period, that's the time when coverage is available against a loss of production of the crop, which is would be a loss of revenue, since these are revenue products for an eligible natural disaster. So typically your coverage period is going to begin when the crop is planted or within 1 day of the approved application for coverage. And your coverage period is going to end on your harvest completion, established normal harvesting dates, or abandonment or total destruction of the crop. For program dates, so for Arizona and California, it's February 28th would be the sales closing date to sign up. So obviously that has passed for 2023. We do have the date of November 20th if you are a late fiscal filer. So as I mentioned, different sales closing dates depending on if you are a calendar year filer or an early fiscal or late fiscal year filer. And your revised farm operation report is going to be due on July 15th. The farm operation report is where you're going to fill out what you intend to grow on your farm for that year. So for payments under either of these programs, we cover natural disasters that can cause a loss and decline in your market price during the insurance period. That could be anything from adverse weather to fire, earthquakes, insects, plant disease, failure of your irrigation water supply, wildlife, or a decline in market price. So your taxes must be filed for the policy year before any claim can be made. When revenue to count for the policy year is lower, excuse me, than the insured revenue, a loss payment will be made. For loss reporting, it's really important that you submit your notice of loss within 72 hours after discovery that the revenue for the policy could be below your insured revenue. So, or in other words, if you know you have one of those insured covered perils that is going to affect your crop or your farm and your revenue, within 72 hours, you would need to notify your agent of that loss. And oftentimes the companies will come and do an inspection on the damage. So here's just a screenshot of our public website, just to give you an idea of how to navigate some of the resources that might be relevant to you. So here on the top tab, we have tools, and some of the more important ones here are going to be this agent locator. So if you're interested in signing up for crop insurance, usually the first step is to contact an agent in your area. They can walk you through what might be a good program for your needs. We also have this actuarial information browser here, which is going to show you the programs that are available by state and county. So it'll tell you which crop programs we have available there. It will tell you the important program dates for whole farm and micro farm as well for you to sign up. And so this is the actuarial information browser that I mentioned. This is what it looks like. So you can filter by your area, kind of see what's also covered here under this commodity list and get some more information. Also in those tools here, I'll go back real quick. So this tools tab here at the top, We also have what is called the cost estimator, which you can also use to go ahead and input your numbers for your operation. Just kind of see what it would cost you in premium to get coverage based on different coverage levels of your choosing. So here's just a quick example of what a cost estimator example would look like. So for Fresno County, in this scenario in California, we have $100,000 in average revenue. As you can see at the 85% coverage level, what your liability would be, the total premium, and down here at the bottom is the producer premium. That's what you would actually pay at the 85% coverage level if you had $100,000 in liability or revenue. So you could see it varies based on your coverage level that you choose, and you'll notice that it's subsidized here. So the total premium versus what your producer premium, what you actually have to pay for the program. So as I mentioned earlier, the agent locator tool is a good tool for you if you're just starting out and you have questions about coverage and for your operation. I would recommend starting there. Here's some more links to some resources. We have some fact sheets on the programs that give you a quick summary of them. And we also have a link here that will take you to that agent locator. And I can drop these links in the chat for you as well. And here's our email, our contact information for our office. This roca@usda.gov, that's our main email. So if you have questions about any of our programs, I'd recommend emailing us there. If you have specific questions regarding whole farm or micro farm, Catherine Anderson is the specialist in our office who primarily works with whole farm and micro farm. So she would be the point of contact there. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if you just wouldn't mind stopping sharing your screen, then I am going to really quick just pull up a survey for the Urban Ag Hours so that we can have from you all your feedback on how you found today and what you'd like to see more of, any suggestions that you all might have. So we'll just briefly put this QR code up on the screen here and drop the link in the chat. I encourage everyone to please just take a quick 5 minutes after this, fill out the survey so we can best meet your needs with these Urban Ag Hours. So yeah, any feedback, topics you want to see, time of day you want the Urban Ag Hour to be, we'll welcome any feedback at all that you all have. Great, and I know it's been in the chat too, so I'm going to stop sharing and we'll jump into our Q&A portion of the event. So we did have a lot of great questions, and thanks everyone for dropping those in the chat. We'll go in order. From Catherine, we had, can you talk, Ashley, about cottage license versus the requirements you were talking about, certifications at the state and USDA level and custom exempt, and sort of what is the cottage license? Does it fit into this?
Yeah, it totally does. So it is a little bit different than the regulations that I talked about. The ones that I talked about are specific for meat products being processed at a slaughter facility. Arizona cottage law is what allows you to make food products essentially at home and sell them to the general public. And so Arizona does have a cottage food law. There is a required registration to do that. It's free. It's a free registration, and it does come with a training that you have to do that's online. I haven't done it, so I don't know how long the training is, but I don't imagine it's super onerous. Basically, that would allow you to sell your homemade goods in a large variety of places. There's some limitations. They don't allow pickled products. They don't allow dried fruit, and I think it's frostings with dairy in them are not allowed. There's a few small random things which would all be covered in the training of what you're allowed to do. That is a little bit different though than the custom exempt and the slaughter type stuff that I was talking about. And I'm going to suspect that if you are selling food products under the cottage food law, that you do need to be using USDA or state inspected meat. You can't use custom exempt meat for that. If that makes sense? Because that custom exempt meat is basically for your own individual consumption, not to be sold. And so by doing it under the cottage law and then selling it, you would then be selling that custom exempt meat. But anything that's been inspected state or federally, you should be able to use in your cottage food production following the cottage food rules. And I apologize, I don't know more about the cottage food rules. It's not something I work in a lot, but we do have that. And Arizona is pretty open about what they're allowed, but you do need to register and do the training.
Thank you so much. And I have another question for you, Ashley. Would you consider bees as a livestock for small scale and urban farms?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know much about bee production because that's not an area I work in or work with a lot, but the publication that I mentioned that talks about all the different livestock species and some of the pros and cons does have bees in it. And I'm going to drop that in the chat right now. So bees are covered in there and they have a lot of information in that for you. So yes.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Sarah. Do you know of any partnerships where a small farm partners with a livestock farmer to allow parts of their farm for grazing? So I guess to get the benefits of grazing without needing to maintain the small animals themselves and specifically ruminants, it seems.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I don't know of anybody specifically off the top of my head who is doing that, but I did mean to mention in my publication or in my presentation, and I forgot that, yes, that's a perfectly viable way to get started in livestock production as well, is inviting somebody else who has livestock to basically lease or sublease a portion of your property for that grazing, so that you don't have to necessarily take on the onus of taking care of the animals or understanding how to care for the animals. They can handle that. So that is a perfectly valid way to get started with a partnership. I don't know anybody off the top of my head doing that right now, but that doesn't mean they don't exist and I just don't know about them.
Thank you so much. I have a question for you, Scott, from Catherine. Do you know who backs the private insurance companies?
The private insurance companies it's a joint cooperative venture with RMA and the private insurance companies. So we have a reinsurance agreement with RMA and the private insurance companies. So they both, to summarize, basically, they both share in the risk of the policies.
Thank you. And then do you know if livestock guardian dogs would be covered under microfarm insurance?
If livestock?
Livestock guardian dogs.
Oh, guardian dogs. That's a good question. That I don't know. That one, I would refer you to the email I put in the chat for Catherine Anderson. I'm filling in for her, so she's a little bit more well-versed in whole farm than I am. She might be able to help you with that one.
Great. And I will reach out to Catherine. We do in our monthly newsletter we send out, we put the Q&As from each Urban Ag Hour. So I'll ask Catherine and get a response from her, hopefully for a July newsletter. And if Jared, you wouldn't mind just dropping that link to subscribe in the chat again, in case folks aren't subscribed, so you can see the answer to that question. We'll send it out mid-July. And I have another question for you, Scott, from Sarah about cut flowers and bees, also edible flowers. Are those three, any of them, all of them insured under whole farm, micro farm?
We do have, yes, bees are covered. We also have a separate apiculture program just for bees, but we do offer coverage under whole farm and micro farm for bees as well. We do have coverage for cut flowers. I'm not sure about edible flowers. That might be another question for Catherine. Catherine's also the specialist who works with the nursery program, so there can be some crossover there as well. So, but we do cover bees for sure and cut flowers. So I'm looking right now in our actuarial information browser, the AIB that I had a screenshot of on our website, where you can kind of filter down. I'm looking right now at Pima County just as an example. And so we do offer coverage for cut flowers, flower bulbs, and others, which I can't answer what others contains, but Catherine might be able to help you with that.
Thank you so much. I have a question for you, Ashley, from Flowers and Bullets. We want to use goats at our small scale educational urban farm. We are a nonprofit that works mostly on donation base and sliding scales. What's the regulation on distributing milk, meat, cheese on a donation basis, so not for sale or profit after a class?
That's going to be a little bit of a legal gray area that I'm going to encourage you to maybe work with. I'm sure you have a lawyer that you might work with to look at the state law and see what you're allowed to do there. Technically, you're distributing to the general public, even if you're not actually selling it. And like I said, that's a little bit of a legal gray area. Milk and cheese products do have their own distributor license that they require that you get for on-farm distribution. So you would probably most definitely have to have one of those. But as far as it being legal on a donation basis, and I'm assuming that you're talking about like custom exempt slaughter type situation. I'm going to refer you to a lawyer on that one, because that's definitely a legal gray area.
Thank you. Another question for you. Winter wheat has done really well as a cover crop for goats. Do you have any suggestions on what else can be grown as a cover crop for grazing for the spring?
Yes, I sure do. So we actually have a publication that I worked on with our agronomist, Mike Ottman, that's got a listing in it of some warm and cool season grasses and legumes that you might be able to pick from. It gives some seeding recommendations. It gives palatability recommendations. So looking at maybe some of those warm seasons, you might be looking at like cowpea, topiary bean, kind of depending on where you are. Grasses, I would not recommend Bermuda. You'll never get rid of that. But panic grass, there's some other options in here. So I'm going to drop a link to that publication for you right there. And you can take a look at it. It's got, like I said, it's got a ton of recommendations in it.
Thank you. We have another question from Catherine. Do you have a good resource to start with to find the regulations for getting licensed to sell milk, and cheese to the general public?
Yes, you're going to want to reach out to the Arizona Department of Agriculture. They're going to be the ones that handle all that licensing.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions, folks, for Scott and Ashley? I saw we did get a question direct to me about the recordings. So the recordings for the Urban Ag Hour, they get sent out to everyone who registered, and we're working on also getting them uploaded to a YouTube channel. So that's to come in the future. You'll have access to every Urban Ag Hour we've hosted. But for the time being, you can email me directly. I'll drop my email in the chat. And if you registered for this on Eventbrite, it'll automatically get sent to you afterwards, after the event. Okay, it seems like that is it for questions. Thank you again, Scott and Ashley. I am going to just pull up one last time that QR code for everyone, and thank you all for joining. We'll have our next Urban Ag Hour in July. That will come out in the newsletter. We'll send out a registration page for that, and we hope to see you all there. So yeah, please take the survey here and let us know what you want to see more of and how we can best support your needs. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks, Colleen. We'll see you later.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Thanks so much. It was a really great presentation.
Anytime. Bye, everyone.
Bye.